Chapter 14. The Edward James Tape. 1. I know what you're going to say. Why the hell did I wait so bloody long? And I also know that any answer will be inadequate. I'm prepared for that. Well, you have to be, more or less, don't you? Dark memories. No, not exactly dark, but there's sometimes a lack of distinctiveness round the edges now, which is then punctuated by a sharp clarity. So I want to do this while I can. I was young then. I was only beginning. I was just a constable who was caught up in a web of deceit, and I ought to have known better. Who was I? 26. I remember that because someone told me I had to start paying into the pension fund before I was 30. If I wanted to stand any chance of a secure retirement. You thought I was rebellious. I was, boy. Or had been, in my own way. I didn't care about security at first. I played rugby in a period when you only did it for the glory, and sometimes you never even got your expenses paid. So I needed to do something, didn't I? Especially after I broke my leg in a sliding tackle and I had to wear a plaster cast. I knew then. That's how part of me decided to become a copper in the first place. I needed to look after myself, and I wanted to get married. You should have seen her then, your Auntie Elsie. Like a sylph of the night she was, dark and elusive, with very pale skin. All right, I can't say it straight out, can I? Even now. Murder's a nasty business, and the details are always more gruesome than you could possibly imagine. And then, well, our resources for dealing it were much more primitive than they are now, of course. And murder here in West Wales was not really expected. None of this is an adequate excuse, I know, but I've never felt good about my part in it, especially about the deaf boy. I don't want to be exonerated, but I do want you, at least, to understand, if you can. We were still in the old station at the top of Miser Bont when the call came in. You know, the one opposite the fish and chip shop that they knocked down last year to put in the roundabout. It was early on a Sunday morning and Bill Griffiths was on duty with me. Remember him? He had a fight with his cousin when he was in school. Anyhow, the call came in. There was hardly anyone about. Too early for chapel even. Brace yourself, boy, Bill Griffiths said to me as he came off the telephone. There's been a murder at Plas Wern Las. I've just talked to the housekeeper. Told her not to touch anything. You better get over there. Too far, Sarge, I said. Take me nearly an hour by bicycle. Then you'd better call Meurig Evans and tell him what's happened. And be polite. Meurig Evans was at DCI at the time, see? Nasty man with a thin face who wore a brown trilby. I never liked him. He was the boss, wasn't he? He was the one who was supposed to be the expert. So I called him, and he came as soon as he could. We went over there together in his Woolsey. Beautiful car, that was. We drove through the gates of Plas Wern Las in the rain. I remember that. There was a clinging wet green everywhere, and the house looked tranquil enough from the outside. Quite a stately place, I'd always thought. Inside was a different story. The crying housekeeper, Mrs. Ann Davies, stood in the hall, wiping her face with a pinafore. There was a man in shirt sleeves standing next to her. He must have been the husband. The body was in the drawing room, sprawled there at a very odd angle. There was a lot of blood. There was a hole in the skull, as big as the head of a hatchet that lay by her side. Bloodstained, of course. I forgot to say, didn't I? That horribly contorted body belonged to Henrietta James. She was 91, and she was one of the owners of Plas Wern Las. I do have to hand it to Meurig Evans, though. I may never have liked him, but he's a cool customer. Stand there, James, he said, pointing to the door of the dining room. Stand there. Don't let anyone in. Murder, sir? No, it's bloody musical chairs. Sorry, sir. Don't be sorry, James. Just stand there and do as you're told. 'Cause that's the way it was with him, see? Absolute. He didn't want you to have a mind, and if he suspected you might be capable of an odd thought or two, he was after you, instantly. No, he didn't want you to have a mind, but he gave himself as much latitude as he liked. And if I sound suspicious and resentful after all these years, that's because I am. That's why I'm doing this. Murder, in my view, should be subject to the same rules as everything else. The investigation, I mean. And nowadays, perhaps it is. You take more samples of more body fluids than anyone ever imagined. You sort data, you do tests, and theoretically you should come up with more accurate results. But do you? Sometimes I wonder. I had to stop because I was tired, and I had to think hard, and I had to be sure that Elsie wasn't standing in the hallway having a sly listen. Because I want to talk about Meurig Evans and his arrest of that deaf and dumb boy, and how it all came about. Forensic can't find anything, James. Nothing incriminating. No, sir. 3 bags bloody full, sir. He got me seconded on the case, see? Got me working as his assistant, doing all the dirty work, and I didn't like it. I had to follow him around and listen to him spout when he felt like it, all the time buttoning myself up. And we had no leads, nothing. All we had was who was in the house at the time, which was mainly Sylvia, dead woman's sister, who was in her late 80s, and that American poet fellow, Waller, who I didn't like on sight, tell you the truth. Too smooth by half he was. He wore +4s for breakfast, you know what I mean? He had a little moustache, and he held his chin up too high. And his voice was a sort of slurry southern accent or something. And the sister gave him an alibi, and he gave the sister one, which put us all at a total impasse, didn't it? So then, in the middle of all this, Meurig Evans turns to me one afternoon. He says, "So, James?" "Sir? What do you think?" I was dumbstruck, wasn't I? After all that, he expects me to have a mind. Fundamentally, what he wants is a bloody factotum, isn't it? But when that doesn't lead anywhere, he expects the factotum to have some grey matter after all. So I say nothing for a long time. And when I do eventually speak, my tone is very measured. I tell him what I've been thinking all along, which is that we should bring the poet in for questioning, see? Should work on him a bit. Then Meurig Evans looks at me, see? And he rubs his chin. He says, "No, I don't think so. I want you to go and arrest that William Davies." "A deaf mute," I said. I knew who he was, of course I did. We talked about everyone who came into the orbit of Plas Wern Las and the estate. We had to. But William Davies, man, he's a beast of burden, he was. He did all the heavy lifting for his father, who did the thinking, such as it was. And we knew he'd worked for the dead woman, clearing land, digging ditches and everything. And we knew he had a relationship with her, but didn't make him a suspect, did it? Not in my mind, anyway. For the murder, sir. I couldn't help it, could I? No, for stealing coal. What else do you think, man? And don't talk back. No, sir. I want you to go out to that farm, and I want you to arrest him and bring him back to the station. You'll be here, sir? I might be with the chief superintendent. I won't be long. And mind you read him his caution properly. Don't want any mistakes. So I had to take Big Will Roberts with me. Remember him? His brother was the prop for Leslie one time. They're all big in that family. Anyhow, we took the car and we drove to the farm situated next to Plas Wern Las. It was late in the afternoon. I remember it distinctly. Water ran down the stony track towards the farm, and the house itself was situated in a sea of churned up mud. It's a miserable place. Whitewash flicked off the walls, and the front gate was held together with binder twine. I knocked on the door, and a short, squat man with powerful arms answered. "Roland Davies?" "Who's asking?" "I think you know the answer to that," I said. "Anyhow, it's not you I come about. It's your son. Leave him out of this." Then Will Roberts said what he always said in similar situations. "Look, we can either do this quietly or we can do it the hard way. It's up to you." Roland Davies gave way after that and led us into the farmhouse. It was worse inside than out. Everything was painted dark brown except for the walls, which had once been whitewashed but were now grey and peeling. There was a single electric light bulb overhead and nothing on the stone-flagged floor. There was an old table in front of the window with 2 places laid. There was a loaf of bread and the remains of a kipper on one of those plates. I remember, see, because the whole place was so strange and desolate. Deaf-mute, William Davies, must have been in his early 20s at the time, was still sitting at the table, eating as if nothing was about to happen. He didn't even look up as we came in. "Come with us," I said. "We need to ask you some questions." Didn't turn a hair, did he? Didn't even look up, but carried on eating as before. It was then that I realised how totally deaf he was, see? There's no communicating with him. It's impossible. So then I called his father over and explained what I wanted. At first, he refused to cooperate. "Boy's innocent," he said. "I'd stake my life on it." "You might have to," Will Roberts said. He's a great persuader, he was. So then the father, Roland Davies, went over to his son, and in a mixture of Welsh and sign language, he explained what he wanted. That basically, the boy, William Davies, better known as Beda, was to come with us. Well, you can imagine. It was a series of grunts, then a struggle. And the table got turned over in the process, and the plate smashed on the floor, and a black cat darted in and stole the kipper, as the deaf William Davies fought with us as if he was fighting for his life, which in a way he was. He's a strong bugger, mind. He had huge muscles in his arms and legs, and hardly any neck. Built like a beast, he was. But it's no good, see. Not Will Roberts there. He was strong himself, and there was a pitiless streak in him. He'd tie up the Queen herself if he had to. Anyhow, it wasn't long before we had Beda in an arm lock on the floor, and I slapped the handcuffs on him, and then we led him to the car between us. "You'd better come with us," I said to the father, Roland Davies. Because once we'd subdued the son, he started to sob, see? And it wasn't a very pleasant sound to listen to. And I knew the father would be worried and would want to be close to his disabled son. I would have been, if I'd have been him. But Roland Davies shook his head. He said he'd go in his own van. Funny, isn't it? I remember that van even now. A brown Morris 1000. One of those high square jobs with 2 windows at the back. Anyhow, when we got to the station, Meurig Evans was waiting for us, naturally enough. He'd shaved, he'd changed his suit. I remember that too, because I thought it was odd at the time. But then Meurig Evans was one of those men with a very dark beard. Twice a day shavers, whole family. So we got back to the station and installed a deaf mute in the interview room. 2 chairs, table, Nothing else. And I swear to you now, Gwendraith, that boy was all right when I left him. Which is what I had to do, as I was nearly at the end of my shift, see? There was not a mark on him then, apart from a small bruise below his left elbow, where he'd fallen to the floor in the struggle in the farmhouse. But by the time I returned the next morning, it was a different story. When I went to see William Davies in his cell, he had a bruise beneath his left eye, and his top lip was swollen. "What's happened to you?" I said to Will Roberts, who was on a similar shift to me. "Prisoner injured, trying to escape." "But he was in the interview room," I said. "How the hell could he escape from there?" "He had to be restrained for his own good." There's often a sort of flatness, isn't there, when someone is talking to you officially. You recognise it. You know it bodes no good for anyone. And you also know there's nothing much you can do. "He's had medical attention," I said. "You've been seen to. And by the way, Chief wants you to go back to Plas Wern Las this afternoon." "He does he?" "Yes. You have to borrow the official car if you need to. He wants a thorough examination of the grounds and exterior of the building, with particular attention paid to attempts at forcible entry." I thought, all that's been done. And why didn't he tell me himself? He's gone home. Been on duty all night. "Doing what?" "Interviewing the prisoner." "Oh, that's the way it is." "If I was you," Will Roberts said, "I'd watch my tone and do as I was told. But you're not me. Couldn't help myself, could I?" "No, I'm twice as sensible. So I couldn't do much more, could I? Not on that occasion." Will Roberts was right, even if I didn't like it. So later that same afternoon, saw me back at the Plas Wern Las mansion, looking for God knows what. It was horribly wet. I can smell it, even now. Rain poured down from the roof and over the gutters and threatened to saturate everything. It bounced off the pathway going round the house and clung to the leaves of the bushes in big, hanging globules. I parked the car at the front of the house. There was no sign of anyone about. I waited in the car for the rain to stop or at least slow down. They all seemed so desolate to me, upper class and creepy, like one of those murder scenes you see in an afternoon matinee. Which is exactly what it was, I suppose. Anyhow, I waited a good while and still saw no one. When the rain eventually did slow, I walked round the house and went in through the back door. Nothing. Not a light on, even though it was quite dark because of the weather. The house felt ghoulish. I went down the corridor to the dining room, which was situated on the left-hand side. I opened the large panel door. Then I found him. He was quite a tall man in a brown suit. Didn't even have a shirt or socks on as far as I could see. He was lying on the floor and he was shaking as if he was trying to stop himself crying, see? I knew who he must be straight away, even though I'd never met him properly. I knew who he was, that American poet, Edwin Waller, the one who was staying with the James sisters. I walked over to him. I mean, I had to, didn't I? Help him if I could. It was horrible. "Leave him." It was quite a commanding voice out of the darkness at the far end of the room. "Who says?" I mean, I may have been a youngster, but I was still one of the investigating officers, wasn't I? "Paul James, a nephew. The man who stepped into the shaft of sunlight that came through the sash windows was about 10 years older than I was, and he was dressed like an off-duty solicitor. Slashed back hair, Irish tweed jacket, woolen tie, expensive brogues. Like someone who knew he was somebody. Edward James, police constable, no relation, I said. Couldn't help it, could I? It was something about Paul James that got up my nose straight away. And I take it this is the poet? Edwin Waller, Paul James confirmed. He was very close to my aunt. He's been like this ever since they removed the body. I looked around the room. Except for a few patches where the floor had been thoroughly scrubbed, there was no trace of violence in the room. If you give me a hand, we can get him to bed, I said, looking down at the grieving man. Anything is better than this. In my experience, with a case of advanced emotional trauma like this one, it is often better to let the subject work it out of his system. Are you a doctor then? I said. No, he said, merchant banker. I've come down from London to help with my aunt's affairs. That explained a bloody lot, that did. Didn't have no more authority than anyone else. Just trying it on, he was. If you won't give me a hand, then move out the bloody way, I said. I was determined. Paul James didn't move, so I reached down then, got my arms around the sobbing man in the brown suit, helped him to his feet as best I could, draping his arm round my shoulder like. Well, I said to Paul James, who hadn't said another word or lifted a finger. He got the idea then, and came round the other side and lifted Edwin Waller's other arm round his shoulder. And between the two of us, we managed to get the poet, who was surprisingly heavy, out of the drawing room and into the hallway, where we began to climb the stairs. I heard it then, faint strains of a very polite music, violins mostly, wafting down the stairs towards us as we climbed. Music got louder as we reached the landing, and half dragged and half carried the poet into a small bedroom to the right. We laid him on the bed, and I took his shoes off and covered him with a counterpane. Paul James had left me to it, he had. Sleep, I said to the poet, if you can. Then I left that room to find out where the music was coming from. It was a strange sight, right enough. In another, larger bedroom, further down the corridor, was a fire burning, and a woman in a wing armchair sitting near it. She was an old woman, with a deeply lined face and a high-necked blouse. Her hair was tied back in a bun, and she sat very erect, as if she was giving a lesson in deportment or something. Paul James now stood nearby, with one arm on the wing of the armchair. As I entered the room, he said, Aunt Sylvia, this is Constable Edward James, our namesake, but no relation. Constable James, this is my Aunt Sylvia. When he had finished speaking, his aunt looked up, turned towards me and said, Young man, I hope you haven't come to tell me there's been another murder. I was dumbstruck, wasn't I? I wasn't expecting such self-possession. I was young. I didn't know about self-control. I didn't know a cool exterior could hide a turbulent heart, did I? Not then. I'm sorry about your sister, I said, or something like that. I can't remember exactly. The shock, the contrast between the gruesome murder, the poet on the point of collapse, and the Palm Court Orchestra playing on the radio, and the self-possession of the woman in front of me, it was all too much. Are there any signs of forcible entry? I said, just like that. I wanted them to know I was doing my job at least. Pardon? It was Paul James who spoke. His voice was cool. I'm going to inspect the premises, I said. And with that, I went back downstairs and began checking everything with particular attention to the drawing room where the murder had taken place. Nothing. Not a wood splinter or a flake of paint or a forced lock. Nothing to indicate force had been used at all. Outside, as far as I could tell, it was the same story. Of course, the torrential rain hadn't helped matters. The flower beds outside the windows were a sodden mess. If there ever had been any clues, they would have disappeared. And by the time I got back to the car, I was a sodden mess myself. I started the engine just to get the heater going, and I had a cigarette and tried to think. Why the hell had Meurig Evans sent me back to Plas Wern Las that particular afternoon? Was he really expecting me to find new evidence, or was there something else on his mind? Of course, as soon as I got back to the station in Meurig, I got part of the answer, didn't I? Will Roberts was sitting at the old Underwood typewriter when I entered, plonking away with 2 fingers. "What are you working on, Will?" I said. "Autobiography?" "Autobiography, hell," Will Roberts said. "What I got here, boy, is William Davies's full confession."